Good morning and welcome to this Batalas update webinar for ISO 9001 and ISO 14001. My name is Maria Jaeger, and with me here today I have Anne Witter, who will do the presentation for you. Her presentation will take about 25 minutes and should give you an overview of the changes in both standards. Following Anne's presentation, Richard Greystock will answer any questions you have in the Q&A session at the end. We've allowed 15 minutes for this, but if there are many questions, we will make sure everyone gets an answer via email. Before we start the presentation, I want to make sure you know that the information given in this webinar represent the opinions of Batalas Limited and are not endorsed by ISO. The information is based on FDIS 9001 and FDIS 14001. Further changes are likely until the published version, so any changes you make to your management systems should be done with caution. As well as a 30-minute presentation and the Q&A session, to make sure you get the most out of this webinar, we'll provide you with a transcript of the narration and all the slides you see. We'll also record this session so you can view it again at your own leisure. You'll receive all this via email after the webinar. So there's no need for you to take notes, just enjoy the presentation, and we will keep your lines muted, but you can write in your questions to us throughout when they are still fresh in your mind. And I will now hand you over to Anne.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning and welcome. The purpose of today's webinar is threefold. Firstly, we'll have a look at the reasons why the standards are changing. Then I will provide you with an overview of the changes of ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, as we know them in the final draft international standard, FDIS for short. And finally, I will give you an idea of the implications that this will have for your organisation and your auditors. Okay, so let's begin by setting the stage for these two standards. ISO 9001 is the most adopted management system in the world, and according to ISO, over 1.1 million certificates were held in 2013, while ISO 14001 had over 300,000 in the same year. In addition to this, consider the many organisations also working towards the standards without yet being certified. Let's compare these numbers to, say, 13485 medical devices and ISO 27001 information technology. Would you be surprised to learn it's between 20 and 25,000 certificates? Let's not underestimate the impact of these two standards that we are dealing with today. Any change made to these two standards will have a huge impact globally, and we already know the proposed changes will be significant. This is arguably the biggest change in management systems since the turn of the millennium. Okay, so why are the standards changing? The first reason is simple: to make sure the standards fit the world they are meant to function in. So as the world evolves, the standards must follow. The second reason is the increase in management system standards available to us today. These new management system standards are being developed specifically to the sector they provide for, and we are now finding many companies are certified to more than one ISO. So in order to allow these different management system standards to talk the same language, they needed a common structure. This will be the big thing happening in both ISO 9001 and 14001. Okay, so how long will this take? Well, reviewing a standard takes time due to the way the standards are drafted. In each stage of the process, the draft must go out to ISO members for comments and to be voted for. This means everyone is involved in the development, and only when there is a consensus will the standards be published. Currently, we are at the final draft stage, and we are expecting the published versions in September. As we move on, we'll be looking at what the major changes to ISO 9001 and 14001 are. For those who may have missed it, please do not worry about taking lots of notes. All the materials will be sent to you after this presentation. Okay, when it was decided that we needed a new version of ISO 9001 and 14001, there was some design specification or criteria that had to be fulfilled. One of the major points was that the revision had to cater for changes in business practices, technology and environmentally since the last revision. As I have already mentioned, the world changes, business change. The other is to provide a core set of requirements that will last for the next 10 years. Therefore, it is essential that the new standard will be fitting for a number of years to come. Let's not forget those with more than one standard. There will be a need to facilitate a more effective implementation. The biggest change is that there is now one high-level structure for all new management system standards. Previously, ISO 9001 had 8 clauses. ISO 14001 had 4. Now both will have 10 clauses. Some of the old clauses have kept their content, but just simply changed their titles. We also have a couple of new clauses, along with some changes to existing ones. But first, let's have a look at the new structure, Annex SL. According to IRCA, it is the most significant innovation in management system standards since the introduction of ISO 9000 itself. There are 3 main points in Annex SL. Firstly, the high-level structure will be adopted for all management system standards. So now all management system standards will have the same clause names and numbering independent of which sector standard it is for. Secondly, the core text will be identical. And thirdly, there will be a common terms and definitions across all standards. The purpose of having one structure is to improve the consistency between them and to make it easier to run a system where you use more than one standard. Common terms and definitions allow them to speak the same language. The identical core text contains the same requirements for all standards. Also, the sector-specific definitions and text will be added, but nothing can be removed. Okay, we're now going to look into the changes clause by clause. Due to the time we have available today, this will only be an overview. For more details, please come along to one of our training sessions. The first 3 clauses have kept their names, and number 1 is scope. Scope gives us the reason we have this standard, and it is unchanged from the previous versions. ISO 9001 will still refer to ISO 9000. It is being updated as we speak and will publish this year. In the 2008 version of ISO 9001, you will find that in the terms and definitions there is a reference to ISO 9000. This will remain the same. In ISO 14001, the terms and definitions is included in the standard itself. This is a new clause for both standards. The definition of an organisation is a person or group that has its own functions with responsibilities, authorities and relationships to achieve its objectives. This is a wide definition and it includes anyone from sole traders to big global companies, whether they are profit or non-profit. The clause established the context of the management system for the organisation, and the organisation must determine internal issues that could impact on the outcomes of its management system. This could, for instance, be the skills of your workforce, but the organisation must also go beyond that and look at external issues like customers' changing needs, regulatory demand. These issues can have a great impact on the business and its outcomes. The relevant interested parties are to be included in the context of the organisation. The definition of a relevant interested party is a person or organisation that can affect, be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. This definition could include anyone. But let's take a closer look at what is meant. Let's start with all parties. This is anyone and everyone. We then narrow that down to only those categorised in an interested party. They are the ones interested in your management system. Further, you can narrow this group down by adding the relevant into the mix. And lastly, you take the relevant interested parties and see who has requirements that affect your management system. We are now left with the people and organisations you need to include in your management system, and it's up to you to determine who these parties are. It could mean owners, shareholders, suppliers and society, but it's up to you to decide. Then it is your job to monitor and review this information. Another big change is the process approach. Now, while it was promoted in the previous version of the standards, it has now been made mandatory. You have to use it. It's as simple as that. Also, your documentation requirements are changing. We no longer have to keep as much documentation as before. The definition of documented information is information required to be controlled and maintained by an organisation and the medium on which it's contained. The new standards state that you no longer need a policy manual, nor do you need to have mandatory procedures or records to keep. Organisations now have a greater freedom to determine their own documentation needs. If your organisation wants to continue using a policy manual, that's okay, it's up to you. The requirement for evidence controls has not been removed, but the extent and format of this documented information is a decision for the organisation itself. Please be aware, though, that some auditors will find the absence of a policy manual and written procedures a real challenge. They will face in future to be confronted by different types of evidence gathering in different formats. Finding your way through an organisation's management system could be much more thought-provoking. This is one of the really big switches in the new standard. We no longer refer to management, but to leadership. So what is the difference? Well, a manager and a leader will be different in the way they motivate people. Whilst managers have subordinates, leaders will have followers. Managers are authoritarian, results-driven, and task-focused, whereas leaders are those that give direction, guidance, and vision. Think of it as you manage things, but you lead people. Okay, so how does this affect a management system? Clause 5 will place requirements on top management. So, what do we mean by top management? The definition is a person or group or people who directs and controls an organisation at the highest level. This is where your scope comes into play. If your scope covers the whole organisation, then top management is the CEO and the board, not the quality and environmental manager or the management representative. If your scope covers an individual office or location within a group, then top management will be the directors or managers of that office or location. So what are the implications of this switch? Well, for starters, the audit programme will include audits of the CEO or the director. For the implementers, it means that they will need to assist top management in providing objective evidence to conformity and creating or updating communication channels and methods in order to allow top management to carry out their new requirements. The quality or environmental manager will need to make top management aware of their responsibilities. There are requirements they can no longer delegate. Finally, auditors will have to audit someone on the highest level in their organisation. So let me give you a few examples of the new requirements for top management. Top management will need to promote the process approach and take accountability for the management system. It will be top management job to address the risks and opportunities that can affect it. They will need to make the system policy available to all relevant interested parties, and as we noted above, there could be a lot more parties involved in the future. For some in top management, this will be what they already do. They may already be playing a significant and active role, and for them this will be straightforward. But for those of you who have delegated all the management system work to the management representative, it will be a challenge in time to adapt to the new requirements. Please note there is no longer a requirement for a management rep, but if you want one, you can have one. Firstly, we no longer talk about preventive action. The focus in Clause 6 is on the planning process, where risks and opportunities are addressed. I guess many will assume risk is something negative, but in this context it is something positive as well. Most organisations will already be used to determining the negative risks they face, but determine the opportunities, they might be new. When risks and opportunities have been determined, the organisation must make plans for what actions they need to take in order to address them. The actions need to be proportionate to the potential impacts that the risks and opportunities could have. Okay, so in short, Clause 7 requirements state that the organisation shall determine and provide resource to establish, implement, maintain and continually improve the management system. There is also a subclause which is focusing on people. The clause on work environment has been broadened to include social and psychological factors. How people feel at work is now just as important as the lighting and air quality they work in. There are also requirements for competence, awareness and communication. Communication covers internal and external communications. Let's put these into steps to make it easier. We must first determine which management systems related matters should be communicated. Step 2, what will be the method of delivery? Step 3, consider the timelines that it will be needed for. And finally, the target audience can now be specified. This may sound difficult, but the who, what, where, when and how are the key questions to get this right. The last part is about documented information. The documented information needs to be protected from loss of confidentiality and improper use. You can see the relevance of this with the electronic data being the norm in many businesses now. And I'm sure you'll agree this is an interesting and much needed change. It is primarily Clause 8 that distinguishes one Annex SL based management system from another. Here you will find the discipline-specific requirements. For ISO 14001, this relates to emergency preparedness and response. The organisation must give serious consideration into the actual and potential environmental impacts that it could have, and how these can be controlled. For ISO 9001, it's about meeting customer requirements and the design of the products and services. In the 2008 version of 9001, you could make exclusions from Clause 7, product realisation, if the requirements didn't fit. Now there are no such exclusions permitted. Also worth noting for ISO 9001 is that it puts communications before determination of customer requirements. This is how we arrange for a product or a service today. Let's take booking a hotel for an example. You will look up online what you want and the relevant rooms available will show. It's unlikely that you would call a hotel and tell them what you want. You choose from what they already have communicated to you on the website and what they have to offer. Purchasing has been replaced by externally provided products and services. By this, they mean the providers externally to the scope of the management system. So if your scope encompasses the whole organisation, then external is someone from the outside of the organisation. If the scope is only for your part of a larger business, then external could be from within the business, but outside of the scope of the management system. So we no longer talk about suppliers, but externally provided products and services. This is Clause 4.5, checking, in ISO 14001, and 8, monitoring, evaluation and improvement in ISO 9001. And the content is much the same as previously. The organisation must decide what needs to be monitored and measured, and what methods to use and how often this is done. There are no requirements for an internal audit procedure anymore, but they still have to be conducted at planned intervals. Although improvement has been present in both standards previously, there is now a change in the content. All references to preventive action have been removed. That's right, as I talked about earlier, it is being superseded by risk or risk-based thinking, but there are some new detailed corrective action requirements worth taking a look at. The organisation has to react to and take action to control the non-conformity and deal with the consequences of it. Following that, they need to determine whether similar non-conformities exist or could occur. This could lead to corrective action across the organisation. So improvement doesn't always take place on a continual basis. Sometimes it occurs as a result of corrective action. Other times it happens through innovation or as a result of reorganisation. Well, I think you'll agree that was quite a lot of information. I hope you're still with me. And please keep those questions coming in. Okay, so let me summarise the changes for you. Annex SL has been adopted as the high-level structure. We now have a common core text and common terms and definitions for all management system standards. Further, you need to consider relevant interested parties, and you don't have to have all the documentation requirements you used to. You must find out who your external providers are, and you have to adopt the process approach. You need to determine the risks and opportunities to your management system, and top management will be directly involved and audited. So let's have a look at the implications for you and your organisation. You need to define not only the organisational context, but also define relevant interested parties and their requirements. it should now be easier for you to integrate more than one management system. It's also essential you review application to products, services, compliance, and environmental impacts. And let's not forget current exclusions I mentioned earlier that need to be reconsidered. You'll need to evaluate not only your current process controls, but also the associated risks. You'll need to ensure that you have adopted the process approach, which is now mandatory. You must also consider external providers beyond just suppliers, and you need to review the scope of current preventive actions. Consider the challenge facing you in the reduction of management systems documentation. How will you identify the needs? So, training and awareness of staff. Well, remember the who, the what, where, when and how I talked about earlier. Who will require the training and what type of training will they need? Where and where will the training take place? And how are you going to approach this? And I'm guessing the elephant in the room is how you're going to get top management involved. Okay, auditors, let's have a look at the implications for you. Less management system documentation, which means it will be more demanding for you to understand the management systems. The document reviews are more important but less effective due to these changes, and more observations are likely. You'll need to allow more time not only for you to prepare, but also to conduct audits. And you will gain a much wider understanding of organisational context and issues. Today, you may have only audited against one standard, but now there's a high probability of encountering integrated systems. Start communicating your needs for the retraining. Many will want to be among the first, so make a commitment now by scheduling your training. So, what do you need to do next? Well, I know being left with all these changes can be quite daunting, but the great thing is that you've already taken the first step by joining us in our webinar today, so well done. Let's be clear about one thing. Although the new standard will be published in September, it does not mean you have to start using it then. The 9001-2008 and 14001-2004 versions will still be up and running for another 3 years. So you and your organisation will have 3 years to make that transition. But let me make a few suggestions on what you can do now. Okay, so firstly, get your copy of the new standard when it is out. Why not do a gap analysis for your management system and start raising the awareness of these changes in your organisation? And why not speak to top management and let them know about the vast changes, along with their involvement and responsibilities within the new standard? And be there for top management, help them prepare for the time and the effort it's going to take to complete the transition. And just remember, you're not alone. Let's look at the training briefly. You will need to consider awareness training for leaders and all staff. And let's not forget about our lovely auditors and implementers. They will need transition training. Let's not be under any illusion. The new ISO standards will involve a lot of hard work and effort in order to bring your management systems up to the new standard. You need to be talking to your management team on how to secure the budget for all these changes, both financially and in terms of time. If you would like to schedule a call to discuss your training needs, please give us a quick call or even drop me an email. My details will follow, and I'll be happy to get that arranged for you. Further information about transition training courses can be found on our website. We will also keep you up to date with information in newsletter and social media channels. Just before I hand back to Maria and the team, for those of you who are Health and Safety 18001 certified, sometime next year there will be a brand new ISO 45001. Okay, that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Once again, thank you for joining me today. It was great to see such a great response. And back over to my colleagues now with your questions.
Many thanks, Anne. That was a great presentation of the changes in 9001 and 14001. We have received a lot of questions, and with me is one of our technical experts, Richard Greystock, who will answer the ones we have time for on air today. We will make sure everyone gets their question answered via email following this session. And it's over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Anne and Maria, for that wonderful presentation. It's nice to see so many people here, a few people I recognise, so thank you for everyone coming. There has been a lot of questions, as my colleagues have said, therefore we'll try and answer the ones that are repeated the most, but we will get back to everyone with an actual question answer, maybe a transcript at the end of this, if you give us a day or two to compile that. Just looking at all the questions now, you'd have to forgive me, I'm looking at them live on the screen now. Some of the questions and answers I've got one here. Someone's asking about the transition period for them as a certified organisation. So they've got 9001 and they are due their 3-yearly certification next June or July. Would they advise preparing for the management system changes now or waiting a while? Depends on the size of your organisation would be the first thing to say. That is that in a smaller organisation, obviously implementation of a management system is in theory takes less time. For those that are in a larger organisation that have many sites, depends on the scope of your organisation, means that it might take a little while. If I said to you that it could take anything between 6 to 12 months to change your management system from the 2008 to the 2015 standard, that gives you an idea of when you should be plotting those changes. So if you've got a change, if you've got an ISO audit next June, I'd suggest perhaps looking at the standard as soon as it comes out. As we said at the start of the presentation, we're basing all this on the final draft international standard, which was released last week, but obviously there could be changes between now and when the published version comes out, which is about the middle of September. Just so that you know, the changes that could be between FDIS and the actual published version are usually very minor. That is that they're usually not technical changes, they are just changes to words that perhaps don't translate to different languages, because obviously ISO is in over 150 countries, so it has to be translated into many different languages. Therefore, it's usually just minor changes like that. I would advise, if you've got your management system being recertified next year, then now is the time to do it. If you haven't got your recertification visit until some point, say 2018, is there a need to move it between now and then? That's more a question for yourselves, in that if you want to have 2 certification audits in a 3-year period, i.e. doubling the cost of your certification, then you could move to the new standard earlier than later. There's no reason to move to it unless it makes sense for you as an organisation. A lot of the clauses in 2008 standard are transposable into 2015, so there's nothing to stop you in the meantime actually changing some of your clauses or some of the things that you do internally over to 2015 that already mean that they're valid for 2008 as well. At the end of this presentation, we've compiled a matrix which is the clauses of 2008 against the clauses of 2015, and any of those that are merged that you could move towards now. So in other words, you could change a lot of your management system already to the new standard, so that when the final changes come along, you then only have a small amount of work to actually do. So just to summarise, if you've got a 3-yearly certification cycle, there's a 3-year transition period. So all we need to do is look at when our certification ends and work out if we need 6 to 12 months in order to do that. Then we go for it. Obviously, if you want to move sooner, then you can do. I hope this answers that question. We'll put, as I say, that in writing to everyone that's attended the webinar afterwards. We've got another question here that by removing some of the documentation requirements, are we not in danger of making the management system the approach to the management system, I think is what they're trying to say, is going to change. Yes, there are less documented procedures in the new, or none to be fact. It doesn't require a policy manual anymore, neither 9000 or 14000. It doesn't require any documented procedures, but it does require documented information, and that means that it's got to be retained or maintained. So if you're certified, you've got to make sure that you meet all the requirements of the standard. If you're meeting those requirements, how are you documenting it? So just because it doesn't say you have to have those mandatory documented procedures anymore, doesn't mean you've got to rip them up and throw them out. You're going to make everyone's life easier if you keep those documents in your system. But what it does mean now is that instead of having to have a very prescriptive quality manual that sits on the shelf that no one ever reads, or sits on the server and no one ever knows what version we're on, it means that if you've got, say, an internal intranet system, it means that a lot of your procedures can now be more focused within systems, and as long as they are documented behind that, then that's going to be easier to audit and easier to prove that you are doing what you say you're doing. We've had another question here saying that as they're all based on Annex SL, if Annex SL changes, what happens to the ISO standards? And that's a really interesting question, because obviously we've never had an Annex SL before. So with Annex SL, if the if the Annex SL changes, by definition, as the ISO standard has to be based on Annex SL, so will the ISO standard have to change. So I don't think they're going to change Annex SL just yet, obviously, as it's still so new, but obviously there's going to be a point in time when it does change. It'll probably go along the lines of a 9001 change. I can't see them changing it for any other reason, but we don't know because it's still early days. But yes, a management system like ISO 9001 or 14001, or whichever management system, would have to change if Annex SL changed. Another question here is, will the 18001 standard, which is the occupational health and safety standard, be structured in a similar way? A lot of you may not have health and safety. I know a lot of our clients that I speak to on a day-to-day basis do. So yes, the whole point of Annex SL is that it becomes a universal management system. If I've spoken to any of them before, you will know that I have said lots of times in the past, there's no such thing as an integrated management system, because 9001 and 14001 and 18001 are all so different. It's more an inline management system than it is an integrated management system. With the advent of Annex SL, is what it means is that we can now take the high-level structure. It's going to cover about 80–85% of your current management systems in one structure, which means that when you want to put 9001 specific in, or 14001 specific in, or health and safety specific, or any other management system that eventually gets revised against Annex SL, it means you just have to add that last little bit in to make it sector specific or management system specific. So 18001 is actually a current BS standard, a British standard. It's not actually international, but it will become an international standard next year, or should I say there's an international standard being taken over from 18001. You'll still be able to certify to 18001 for many years to come. There isn't been a date for that to go, but ISO 45001 will replace the health and safety standard. That, by its very definition, will be based on Annex SL, because any ISO standard that's now either published from scratch or revised now has to follow Annex SL. So yes, it will be, the 18001 or 45001 will be structured in a very similar way to 9001 and 14001. We have another question here, actually about auditing, and it's about IRCA registered auditors. I'm not sure how many of you are already registered auditors with IRCA, but will they have to do transition training in order to become certified or keep their certification with IRCA? In a nutshell, yes. If you are a registered auditor, IRCA are mandating that you've got to move across to the new standards. There's another couple of questions about training that I'll answer in a second, that question for you, Rebecca, if that's okay. Lots of questions about the 3-year transition period. I might do a bit of a diagram about how you would change things and the transition, and put these with the notes at the end of the session, so there's quite a lot of questions about that. I've got a question here saying someone's implementing ISO at the moment. Is it worth holding on for the 2015 standard? Well, you can still register for 2008 all the way through to 3 years from when it's published. So you could still go for say, September 2018, just a little bit before. You could still register to the 9001-2008 standard. I don't know what the point would be, depending on how far you are with your development of the management system. If you've got enough time now, if it's going to take you a few more months to do your implementation and then prove that implementation and get certification, it's probably worthwhile doing the 2015 standard earlier rather than later. I have another question here from Sandy. How does the change affect AS9100 Aerospace? Oh, that's an interesting question. All standards, as I said a second ago, that are developed by ISO, that is, of which AS, although it's an AS standard, it is actually an ISO standard as such. Well, in the eyes of most, it has to follow Annex SL. So all ISO standards in the future that are either based on AS9100 is actually based on 9001. So by definition, every time 9001 has changed, so has the aerospace standard changed, usually 6 to 12 months afterwards. So we had a 2008 revision of 9001, and we had a 2009 revision of AS9100 Aerospace. So the most logical step is it will be revised against Annex SL and ISO 9001. There's actually a note on one of the AS9100 websites that actually says that the working group that look after it have actually committed to actually follow Annex SL and 9001 in future. So there's another interesting one that we do a lot of training on, which is ISO 13485, medical devices. It is loosely based on 9001, but it's the only standard to be based on 9001, but have some clauses removed. It's the only sort of QMS derivative that does that. That is having a change later this year, so anyone with ISO 13485 medical devices, that's having a change later this year. We don't know what those changes are. We haven't seen the FDIS of that yet, so more information on that to follow, but that'll be a very specific webinar. So to answer Sandy on the AS9100, yes, it will affect AS9100. If you've got just one certification to AS9100, which obviously by definition will mean that you're also certified or fulfilled the requirement, should I say, to 9001, you will be able to keep that, because as soon as AS9100 meets the Annex SL requirements and the new 9001 requirements, then you'll have both as such, because a lot of companies combine with AS9100 their certification. If you've got them as separate, you can move your 9001 to it, and then you've only got a tiny bit to add the AS to it afterwards. But a very interesting question. A question here asking, do we still recommend the use of PDCA? Well, yes, that's a great question again. PDCA, at the end of the day, is just good business practice. So, we do it all day, every day. So, yes, very much PDCA applies to any management system at any level in that sense. At the end of the day, we plan how the management system is going to work. We operate the management system. We check that it's doing its job, and then we make any adjustments. Well, that's what we do with any business process day in, day out, isn't it? So, I'd hope that we all use a version of PDCA, maybe not in that title, but of that every day in our work. Therefore, in the DIS standard and the FDIS standards of both of these standards, it's very much mandated that we use PDCA going forward. There's a lot of questions on interested parties and whether a specific person in their scope of their organisation or whatever would be relevant as an interested party. I'm not sure I can answer all of those on a Q&A session like this. Those that have asked those questions will come back to you individually and recommend those, because interested parties, it can actually go as long and as far as you want. In other words, as a training organisation, where does our interested parties go? Obviously our clients are an interested party, our staff are an interested party, our shareholders are. Are the training venues that we use, the hotels that we use, are they an interested party? Because it's down to our success that they will hopefully be successful. So do I include them as an interested party? So as you can see, interested parties go so deep into the scope of the organisation that those are questions we'll probably answer individually, should I say. I've got one from Shane here, says, so Annex SL contributes to the end of the IMS. That's a really good question. Someone here has said, does Annex SL, I think the actual question was, so Annex SL contributes to the end of IMS. For those that have got an integrated management system, the idea was that if we truly integrate them, as I said earlier, they're more in line. With Annex SL, it means they can be so properly integrated and so interwoven, you can have one management system that genuinely covers all ISO standards in theory that follow Annex SL. We will have an IMS, but it will be of a different type now. You can still put a lot of effort, for those that their full-time job is controlling an IMS and being the management, of looking after the IMS. Then of course we can make this as difficult or as easy as we like. It depends on the scope of the organisation itself. We're getting quite a few more questions in now, so I apologise. I've got one here saying, will an internal auditor be required to internally audit the leadership team from a lady called Vicky? Absolutely yes and no. Someone in your organisation will need to audit, as we've still got a clause similar to 822 in 9001, for example, where it says that we must internally audit our management system at planned intervals, blah, blah, blah. There's still clauses in, an identical clause to that in the new versions of Annex SL and any system based on that. So someone in the organisation, whether it be an external auditor or an internal auditor, will need to audit top management. How we audit top management, I don't know, in the sense of every company is very different. Is the top management of a big company based in America and their offices are in the UK, are they the shareholders, are they the top management as defined in the management system? That is a question that we'll be answering on a specific basis. But someone in the organisation will need to audit their top management, I say whether it be external or internal, they can do that, because where top management now needs to be fully involved, i.e. we're now getting rid of the clause for management rep. Doesn't mean we've got to get rid of one, but we now need to prove as management that we are now fully committed to the management system. So someone's got to audit us to make sure we're doing that. I don't know how you do that with someone so senior in the organisation. That would be quite a hard one. To, you know, an internal auditor that just does it on a day-to-day basis for a few hours a week, few hours a month or whatever, how they go to the top management in a big organisation and audit them is yet to be seen. And that leads us on to, if we're not having any documentation, how do we audit that documentation? Or sorry, how do we audit the management system when there's no documentation? At the moment, you give me a procedure and I'll come and audit you internally to see if you're fulfilling that procedure. That's quite simple. It's a document. It says this is what I do, and then I just check that as an internal auditor you're doing what you say you're doing. If you've got no documents, procedures, how am I going to come in and audit you? It would be very hard to audit you when there's absolutely no documentation. And that is actually something we'll be training on over the coming months and years. The changes to auditing itself in general, there's going to be a shift from the type of auditing we do at the moment. There's no change to the ISO standard that looks after auditing, but obviously as the requirements are changing, and quite significantly in the sense of no documentation requirements, then we'll be teaching on our training courses how you physically audit something where there's no documentation behind it, because it is a shift in auditing. I would hope that we don't just all throw away our documents procedures, because we don't need to. They're just not mandated that we need them in future. So from my point of view, I'd say keep hold of the ones that you use, get rid of the ones that you don't and actually mean nothing to you and just slow you down as an organisation. Someone's asked, would a relevant interested party be a recruitment agency? It is actually down to you to actually state that. And yes, they're providing staff. There's obviously competency requirements in all ISO standards. So therefore, to prove competency, are we using a competent recruitment agent that knows what our contract is of employment, etc., etc. So yes, you could include them. I would suggest that we look at the local interested parties first. We had that diagram earlier in the presentation from Anne that explained the relevant interested parties, and there are many interested parties, but let's just look at the relevant ones. We could expand that out and out, but I would suggest that we just look at the relevant ones in the early days. But we will be doing individual webinars or videos on what is a relevant interested party and why do we need one, and how far does the scope go. The questions are coming in thick and fast. Would it make sense to do ISO 9001 transition before training 14001 from scratch? Oh, I don't know how to answer that one. That's another question from Shane. I would say everything's based on Annex SL. The training that we're going to be offering means that you will have a day on Annex SL and then a day on the specific training that you've gone on. So if you wanted to go on 9001, you would come on a 2-day training course. We'll teach the first day what is Annex SL, and the second day what are the differences with 9001, and how do we audit a management system for 9001 when it's based with no documentation, etc., or how do we audit top management. You then would only have to do one more day to add the 14001, because you've already done 1 day of Annex SL. And as all management systems will be based on Annex SL in future, you'll have 1 day on Annex SL and 1 day on the sector specific or the management system specific. So 1 day on 9001 and 1 day on 14001 and 1 day on 18001 or whatever it may well be. Another question from a gentleman called Paul, will internal auditors need to be retrained? Yes, to learn the new art of auditing without documentation, but if you're not getting rid of your documentation, I would argue that internal auditors probably don't need to be retrained. There's a lot of scaremongering going on in our industry at the moment about get your training now, get your training now. Internal auditors, if you are doing internal audits where you're taking a procedure and saying, here's my procedure, somebody else in the organisation has checked my procedure meets the standard, what we call a stage 1 audit document review. If somebody's already done that for you higher in the tree and you know that procedure meets ISO 9001 and you're just going onto the, I call it shop floor, but if you're going to the shop floor to say, does this procedure meet the, are we doing what the procedure says we should be doing, then that procedure is not changing, and the way we audit that is not, as long as the documentation's there, it's not going to change. So why does an internal auditor have to have to have any retraining when we're not really changing what they're doing. If an internal auditor, on the other hand, on a smaller organisation, or where you've got less internal auditors, audits the management system and every area of the management system, so not just the procedures, also against the management system, also against top management, yes, they will need retraining. So anyone more than an internal auditor, a sort of procedural-based internal auditor, will need to have more training. We're offering that. It's all on our website. We'll be sending information out in due course about that. I think I've covered that one to death now. We've got another one here. Can a quality manager be part of top management team, or should the quality function be independent of top management? There's nothing in the ISO standards that I personally know of that states that a quality manager, he's got manager in his name, top management leadership. At the end of the day, we've got to prove that top management are actually involved, and that they have to now actually prove that. So could a quality manager be in the top management, or does he need to be put at top? No, they can still be the management rep, but at the end of the day, if they're responsible for the whole management system, it makes sense that they're more senior in the chain. But you're not going to ask the CEO to be your management rep in future, or your quality manager, are you? So as long as the quality manager has got access to the top management to be able to prove to them, or they prove to him or her, that they're actually doing their job properly in the sense of management system, then that function could be independent, could be internal. It all depends on how we go from there. We've got a question here. Will future QMS or EMS auditor lead auditor training course be delivered on 9001 2015? I have a course that I've booked with you in September. Good question. The new standard's coming out literally September sometime. We don't know whether it's the start or the end of September. We can't really give lead auditor training until we get criteria from IRCA, because all our 9001 courses are IRCA approved. So until we get criteria from IRCA on the course, the day we get criteria, we then develop our courses based on the new criteria. We have to submit it to IRCA. IRCA then takes several weeks at minimum, because obviously they're a busy company at the moment. So IRCA then takes several weeks in order to go through those, those changes that we've made to our training courses. They then have to do a document review on those, and they have to come and physically see the course. As you can imagine, with all the training organisations throughout the world that are going to be changing their management systems, changing their training courses, there's going to be a big queue of people waiting. So is it right? Will everyone at the moment want 2015 training? Or if you're not moving your management system over to 2015 until, say, 2016-17, if I teach you 9001 2015 today, and you don't use it until 2016, even 2017, will you still remember everything I've just taught you today? Probably not. So my argument would be, do you need 2015 training, that far in advance? So the September courses will probably be 2008 still. I would anticipate perhaps October, if not November, as soon as the criteria is out from IRCA, and IRCA have given us the approval on it. You're not allowed to do it until you've got approval on it, basically. So as soon as you've got the approval on it, we'll be running them on the new standard. We will be hopefully having by then foundation courses on the old standard, on the 2008, which will be e-learning based. So for those of you that still need to learn 2008, we'll have options for that to be able to happen. So those people that are doing courses at the moment, or in September, August or September, you will be receiving a discount voucher to say, look, if you want to upgrade to the 2015 standard after you've done your training, you'll get quite a considerable discount off that training, because you shouldn't be penalised. The standards changing around when you're having your training, but at the end of the day, if you're still needing that knowledge of 2008 for another 12-18 months, you need the 2008 training now, and then we'll just top up your 2015 training at a later stage. We have got lots and lots more questions. I'm conscious that we said this webinar would be 45 minutes an hour, I think. So I'll try and take a couple more questions, and then we will. Oh no, I'm told this is the last question. With all standards adopting Annex SL, do lead auditors have to retrain on all standards, or will it suffice just to train on one and overlap cover? Okay, again, that's a really interesting question. There's a lot of changes in our industry at the moment, so a lot of us are second guessing what could happen, and until IRCA or any of our governing bodies tell us what is actually happening, it's impossible to say for definite. And we are in constant communication with our training bodies. So to answer that question, could you just have one training against, say, 9001 and then just do some top up to 14,001 until IRCA give us guidance on it? I'm probably going to bow out of that question. It sounds like a cop-out, but how do you have you already got a knowledge of the previous standard? Have you not got a knowledge? Or how do you prove competency? If your certification body auditor walks in and says to you, provide me with evidence that you are competent at say 14,001 2004 or 9,001 2008, and against the 2015 versions, how would you do that unless you've got some kind of documented evidence to prove that you are competent at what you're doing? So that's a really interesting question. I would maybe we'll get some clarification before we send out these FAQs. We've actually got a meeting scheduled with IRCA tomorrow to discuss some of the changes, so maybe we can take that one to the table and see what their advice is on the way back. I think based on the time, there are some other sort of 75 more questions that I could go through. I don't think I will at the moment. I think what we'll do is we'll add them to a Q&A page, and we'll send that across to everyone that's interested. I'd like to thank everyone for their time on this webinar. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. We haven't made it too detailed on purpose. There are lots more detailed things to come in the pipeline. If you've got a particular interest, whether it be a different ISO standard or you know, you think, oh, do you know what, I prefer 1 hour webinars, one on clause 4, one on clause 5, and I'll join them individually, or just recorded videos that you can watch at your own leisure maybe. Just drop us an email. The details are on the screen at the moment. Just email training@Batalas, or my colleague Anne, who's an account manager here, will be able to answer any of your questions. So if there's anything in particular that you want, just email us. We are, you know, we're a 50-odd-year-old company. We're independently owned, so we haven't got the rules that a lot of the bigger companies have got to follow. So we can obviously accommodate virtually any need as such, as long as there's a business case for it. So just drop us a line and we'll see what we can do. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And if you've got any questions, you know where we are. Thank you very much.